Now you work for me and Epstein. Your job is to make all these children disappear, and don't ask too many questions, just do it. Otherwise, we'll kill you and your entire family.
P. Diddy's private driver has just been arrested by the FBI and told the police everything. He was accused of being part of the biggest child trafficking scheme in the United States, which was led by American rapper P. Diddy and tycoon Jeffrey Epstein in one of the most macabre schemes ever discovered, involving thousands of children and teenagers. But before we dive into this abyss of secrets and power, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to discover more stories like this. The P. Diddy driver's report to the police begins as follows. My name doesn't matter, but what I know will chill your spine. I worked as a private driver for one of the most influential men in the music industry, P. Diddy, for almost 8 years. During that time, I saw things I should never have seen, heard conversations that made me question everything, and was complicit in secrets that destroyed thousands of children's lives. When I started, I thought it would just be a regular job, driving for celebrities, lavish events, and all-night parties. But it didn't take long to realize that the glow of fame hid something much more sinister. It was like I was in a horror movie, but without a script. It all started one summer night in 2013. I was called in a hurry to pick up P. Diddy from a luxurious, isolated house outside the city limits. It was one of several properties he frequented, but this one was different. There were no parties, loud music, or paparazzi at the entrance, just silence and armed security guards. That night, I saw Jeffrey Epstein for the first time. He was next to P. Diddy, laughing like they were old friends. As he got into the car, Epstein gave me a cold look, as if he knew I was invisible. They spoke in codes, but it was clear that they were discussing orders and new names on the list. My blood ran cold, but this was not the time to ask questions. Over the years, I've been instructed to take Diddy on strange dates on private jets and remote estates. On several occasions, he asked me to pick up packages. I never saw what was inside, but they were handled with extreme caution. On one of these trips, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Jeffrey said the guests need to be kept off the radar, Diddy said from the back seat as Epstein nodded. The word guests sounded innocent, but the tone was disturbing. Once, when I was called to pick up guests at a private airport, I realized they were children. There were no parents, just men in suits taking care of them as if they were merchandise. My conscience began to weigh down, but the fear was greater. I knew what happened to people who asked too many questions or tried to break out of that kind of circle. The parties, the trips, the properties, it was all part of something much bigger. I was just a disposable cog in a well-oiled machine. Today, I decided to talk about why I can no longer live with this weight. The nights I spent behind the wheel, listening to their conversations, seeing innocent faces being treated like products, are images that never leave my mind. Their power isn't just money or fame, it's total control, enforced silence, and destruction of anyone who tries to stand up to them. This is just the beginning of what I have to tell you. What you are about to hear is not just a story. It is a call to expose the truth. As the years passed, I began to understand that P. Diddy wasn't just a music mogul. He was part of something much bigger, a network where fame, wealth, and power were used to cover up acts that would make any ordinary person tremble in fear. Jeffrey Epstein's name came up frequently, but he wasn't the only one. There were politicians, billionaires, Hollywood stars, all connected by an invisible thread of dirty secrets. I was once instructed to take Diddy on a date he called a special dinner. This took place in a gigantic mansion in the Hamptons. When we arrived, the doors were already open, as if they expected no one would dare break in. The place was packed with famous faces, actors, CEOs, musicians, even people I recognized from television as influential politicians. It was a party, but not like the others I had seen. There were no cameras, there were no crowds of fans. The air was thick, as if everyone knew they were in forbidden territory. What impressed me most that night were the special guests. They were children, all dressed impeccably, walking around the room as if they were part of the decor. They didn't laugh, they didn't play. They seemed trained to follow orders. While waiting in the car, I heard Diddy and Epstein discussing an upcoming event. They talked about guest lists and keeping everything under control. A phrase stuck in my memory. Silence is bought with fear. I couldn't understand what exactly that meant until I heard another snippet of the conversation. We have judges and police chiefs on our side. That same night, when we left the mansion, I noticed something disturbing. Two men were carrying a heavy suitcase into the trunk of my car. I was instructed to take her to a small private hangar where a jet was waiting for us. I asked what was in the suitcase just to break the silence, and the security guard next to me said, "You don't want to know." When we arrived at the hangar, I saw Epstein waiting with a sinister smile. He opened the suitcase right there, while Diddy watched with a glass of whiskey in his hand. Inside were envelopes stuffed with money and a stack of photographs. I couldn't see the details, but I swear I saw images of young faces, very young. Epstein looked at me for a moment and said, "Did you see something?" I shook my head no, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. What scares me to this day is the scope of this web of connections. On another occasion, I was sent to pick up a guest of Diddy's at a luxury hotel. It was a girl who couldn't have been more than 14 years old. She was scared, but at the same time she seemed to understand that there was no way out. When we arrived at our destination, it was handed over to Epstein, who smiled and said, "Another promise kept." It was impossible to escape this net. Everyone had a role, even if small. Lawyers, business people, security guards, even drivers like me. You were just a piece in a bigger puzzle, and any attempt to leave meant the end of your life, or worse. Diddy was a master at manipulating this web. He used his influence to open doors and keep secrets buried. He once told me, real power isn't being in front of the cameras, it's controlling those behind them. I knew he wasn't talking about music. He was talking about the system he helped build, a system where children disappeared, secrets were sold, and no one asked questions. This network wasn't just about Epstein or Diddy. It was about an entire world of people willing to do anything to keep their privileges untouched. What I witnessed was just the tip of the iceberg, but it was enough to keep me awake at night, afraid that one day they would come after me too. I've never been to the island myself, but I've heard enough to know that it was the heart of Epstein's operation. They called the place the Island of Silence because it seemed anyone who set foot there left with a pact of forced silence. What they told me and what I heard in conversations in the backseat of the car was more terrifying than any horror movie. Once, after one of these sinister parties, while driving P. Diddy back to his Los Angeles mansion, he was clearly intoxicated. He laughed as he spoke to one of his friends on the phone, saying, "That island is a business paradise. Jeffrey knows how to keep everyone under control. Who's gonna talk? Nobody gets out of there alive if they talk." Those words kept echoing in my head for weeks. I didn't know what he meant exactly, but when rumors began to surface about disappearances of people who visited the island, I understood what was implied. The island was more than a refuge for the elite. It was a place where secrets were shared, alliances were formed, and the innocent paid the highest price. Diddy never hid his admiration for Epstein, calling him the strategist. According to him, Epstein had a special talent for providing unforgettable experiences. A euphemism that, in the context of the conversations I overheard, meant something much darker. Diddy once mentioned an event that had occurred on the island. "We brought guests from all over the world. A perfect night. Even the stars seemed to be aligned." He laughed, but there was something cold in the way he spoke. He described how Epstein ensured that all of the guests' needs were met, regardless of how disruptive they were. The island was also the place where control lists were kept. From what I understand, these lists were a form of blackmail. Epstein recorded everything: hidden cameras, microphones in strategic places. Celebrities, politicians, and business people left the island carrying memories they could never admit publicly, while Epstein kept detailed records of their every move. One night, when Diddy was clearly nervous, he said to me, "Did you know Jeffrey has a safe on that island? He keeps recordings of all of us. It's his safe." He laughed, but it seemed more uncomfortable than amused. What scares me most about the island is that no one ever seemed to come back the same. I saw people in the car with Diddy weeks after visits to the island, pale faces, empty eyes. It was as if they had left a part of themselves there, a piece they could never get back. Hearing these stories, seeing how Diddy and Epstein treated the place, made me feel like the island wasn't just a physical location, but a representation of all that is worst about humanity. It was a place where innocence died and silence was bought with fear and death. Now, remembering all this, the only thing I wonder is, how many more know these secrets? How many went there and came back carrying invisible scars? And more importantly, how many didn't come back? If there's anything I've learned over the years, it's that P. Diddy knew exactly how to move to avoid suspicion. He was a master at manipulating the public narrative, always projecting the image of a successful, charismatic, and philanthropic tycoon. But when you get to know him up close, you realize that this facade hides something much darker. One of my strangest assignments happened in 2015. I was instructed to pick up a delivery from an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Miami. When I arrived, I found two men who looked uncomfortable, as if they knew they were doing something dangerous. They handed me a sealed package and said, "Take this straight to the boss. No stopping, no questions." Handing the package to Diddy, he quickly opened it and revealed what appeared to be a set of files. I managed to spy one of them before I was sent away. It was a list of names. Names of influential people, many of whom I recognized from the media, accompanied by dates and locations. What shocked me most was that there were photos attached, and some of them showed children next to these figures. Days later, Diddy called me for a private conversation. He never did that, so I was nervous. He began by saying, "You know that everything you see or hear with me stays between us, right?" I confirmed, because I knew that denying it would be dangerous. He then said something that left me speechless. "These names and these photos are our insurance. In the world we live in, you either control people or they control you." Diddy had a system. He used parties, trips, and events to bring people of interest together. Once they were in his orbit, he introduced them to Epstein. It all seemed so casual, but it was actually a trap. When people accepted special invitations, they automatically became vulnerable. Diddy and Epstein made sure there were records of everything, creating a cycle of blackmail that no one could escape. What scared me most was how casually Diddy talked about it, as if it were just another part of his business. He prided himself on being the go-between, the man who connected the right people. "Jeffrey has the tools, and I have the contacts," he once said. "Together, we are unstoppable." There was one night in particular that still haunts me. I was instructed to pick up a young woman from a luxury hotel. She didn't speak much English and seemed lost, as if she didn't understand where she was. When I delivered it to the designated location, Diddy looked at me with a strange smile and said, "She's the ticket to something bigger. People are going to pay dearly for this." What disturbed me most was that he didn't see himself as part of the problem. For him, it was just a strategy, a way to stay on top. But I knew the truth. I saw the fear in the victim's eyes, heard the whispers at parties, felt the tension in the air. Diddy always said that true power was in knowing what others want to hide. He used it as a weapon, destroying lives while protecting his own. But no matter how hard he tried to cover his tracks, there were always little slips, fragments of truth that slipped through the cracks. These fragments, combined with what I witnessed, form a frightening picture. He wasn't just a participant. He was a facilitator, an architect in a game where the victims were disposable pawns. If you think that the secrets of these elites can be easily exposed, you are mistaken. What I've learned over the years is that true power isn't just in money or fame, but in the ability to control everything around you, from people to entire systems. Jeffrey Epstein and P. Diddy were masters at this game, but they didn't operate alone. I was once instructed to take an envelope to a man whose name was known to everyone, a high-ranking official in a government agency. They didn't tell me what was in the envelope, but the way Diddy looked at me before handing it over said it all. It was something that would guarantee that man's silence or his collaboration. On the way back, I couldn't help but ask, "What exactly is going on, sir?" Diddy laughed and replied, "The only thing you need to know is that in this world, everyone has a price, and I'm good at finding it." That sentence summed it all up. They had an impeccable system to make sure no one talked. Journalists were bribed or threatened. Witnesses disappeared or had their lives destroyed. And when that wasn't enough, there were always conveniently fatal accidents. There was a night when Diddy got a call that clearly pissed him off. He shouted into the phone, "I told you to sort it out. I don't want that name in the papers anymore." After hanging up, he looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "Sometimes people need a reminder of who's in control." Days later, an investigative story that mentioned Epstein was taken off the air without explanation, and the journalist responsible disappeared from the media for months. What scared me most was how the elites managed to manipulate everything in their favor. Diddy once casually mentioned, "Did you know we have judges, police chiefs, and even politicians in our pockets? That's why we never get touched." He said this with so much pride that he seemed to believe he was above any law. I remember a situation where one of Diddy's security guards mentioned a case of a witness trying to expose something about Epstein. "She disappeared out of nowhere," he said, laughing. "No one dares to ask what happened because they already know the answer." The cover-up network was so extensive that it seemed impossible to break it. Powerful lawyers ensured that any legal proceedings were quickly dismissed. When they couldn't bribe someone, they simply destroyed the person's reputation, ensuring that no one believed them. One of the scariest moments was when Diddy told me, "If you think you're protected by speaking up, think again. The system works for us, not against us." That phrase stuck with me, a constant reminder that even though I knew what I knew, I was powerless to act. They had the resources to do anything, erase evidence, create alibis, manipulate investigations. It was like fighting a ghost. You knew it was there, but you couldn't touch it. This cover-up machine was the backbone of everything they did, ensuring their darkest secrets remained buried. In the end, it was clear that they were not just protecting their interests, but silencing voices. Flying under the radar, manipulating the world like puppeteers, they have turned fear into their greatest weapon. If there's something that keeps me up at night, it's remembering the victims. They were the most vulnerable part of this network, invisible to the world and disposable to those who exploited them. During my years working for P. Diddy, I saw more of these victims than I care to admit. Young, with lost looks and bodies that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of pain, even at such a young age. One night, I was called to a task that I will never forget. I was instructed to pick up a group of guests from a private hangar. I got there and was greeted by two men who handed me a group of girls. They were dressed impeccably, as if they were on their way to a party, but the fear in their eyes said otherwise. As I was driving, I heard one of them whisper to the other in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was universal. Despair. When we arrived at our destination, one of the girls hesitated to get out of the car. She looked at me directly, tears streaming down her face, and said in broken English, "Please help." I couldn't respond. I knew what would happen if I tried to intervene, so I remained silent, carrying a guilt that never went away. Many of these victims were brought from other countries with promises of a better life. Some didn't even know where they were. In a conversation between Diddy and one of his bodyguards, I heard something that gave me goosebumps. The younger, the more profitable. Innocence is the most valuable currency. He said it emotionlessly, as if he were discussing numbers on a financial statement. There was one night in particular when Diddy was especially upset. A problem had arisen. One of the young women escaped from one of the properties and managed to contact the local police. Diddy, enraged, made several calls, and within hours the situation was resolved. The girl was returned, but I never saw her again after that. What hurts me most is that many of these victims tried to seek help, but no one was there to listen to them. Or worse, those who managed to speak were discredited and silenced. At a party, I heard Epstein say something that summed up their philosophy. People would rather believe comfortable lies than face inconvenient truths. That's why we'll always be safe. On another occasion, I heard a fragmentary account from a young woman as I drove her back to the airport. She said, "They took everything from me. My childhood, my dignity, my life, and no one cares." These words haunt me to this day. These voices, these stories, were not just reports of abuse. They were cries for help that echoed in a void where no one was willing to listen. The system was set up to protect the guilty and ignore the innocent. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that these victims never had a chance. They were seen as tools, disposable after fulfilling their purposes. What's worse is that even when they escaped, their voices were drowned out by a system that worked tirelessly to protect the powerful. This grim reality is not easy to accept, but it needs to be told. Because in the end, it is these voices from the shadows that reveal the true extent of this network's cruelty. I will never forget the day I heard about Jeffrey Epstein's death. P. Diddy was driving to an event, and the news exploded on the car radio. Jeffrey Epstein, accused of sex trafficking, was found dead in his cell, apparently suicide. Diddy was in the back seat taking a sip of whiskey and laughed. "Well, the show must go on," he said, showing no emotion. But I knew that wasn't a coincidence. Nothing in their world was. Epstein's death was a wake-up call for everyone connected to his network. He knew too much, had a vault of secrets that could ruin powerful lives, and now he was dead. Over the next few days, Diddy's behavior changed. He seemed more nervous, more paranoid. Suddenly, there was a flurry of emergency meetings and whispered conversations. One time, while I was driving, he made a call to someone he called the details man. He asked, "Are all our records safe? I want to make sure nothing connects me directly." That's when I realized that Epstein's death wasn't just an isolated event. It was a calculated move in a game of survival between the most powerful. Diddy knew that any mistake could be fatal. He even mentioned once, "Jeffrey wasn't stupid. He knew they were going to come after him, but I think he underestimated how much they were willing to do to silence him." Theories about what really happened to Epstein began to circulate, but the truth was that no one really seemed to want to know. People were more comfortable accepting suicide as a convenient explanation. But the conversations I heard in the car said otherwise. One of Diddy's associates, who I only knew as Mr. C, got into his car one night and started talking, not realizing I was listening. If he had spoken, the world would have fallen apart. He knew too much about all of us, and you know how these things work. Either you die or you make someone else die for you. Epstein's death was also a warning to others. It was a clear message. If he, with all his wealth and influence, couldn't escape, what makes you think you can? Diddy seemed to understand this perfectly. He began avoiding certain parties and gatherings, saying times were changing. But what haunts me most is what he said one night as he stared out the car window, lost in thought. Jeffrey's death didn't end anything. It just rearranged the board. Now it's every man for himself. Epstein's downfall didn't expose the network's secrets, it just buried them deeper. People like Diddy continued their lives, protected by layers of power and influence. But the silence that followed was deafening. The victims remained forgotten, while the culprits found new ways to operate in the shadows. It was as if Epstein had died, but his presence still loomed over everyone. He became a ghost that haunted the elite, a constant reminder that in their world, silence always wins. As I tell this story, I feel as if each word is a blade cutting into an open wound. For years I lived in silence, carrying the weight of what I saw, what I heard, and what I was complicit in for fear of speaking. But the victims, those innocent souls, don't have the luxury of hiding like I did. They live every day with the scars, physical, emotional, and invisible. This network, led by people like Jeffrey Epstein and facilitated by others like P. Diddy, not only destroyed lives, she created a legacy of pain that will echo for generations. The victims who survived carry trauma that will never be erased. They were discarded, forgotten by a system that prioritized the powerful over the vulnerable. There was a young woman, whose name I never knew, who was a turning point for me. One night, after a party where she was brought in as a guest, I saw her face as she left. She was hurt, not physically, but something inside her was broken. Before getting into the car to be taken back to the airport, she looked at me and said, "Nobody's ever going to save us, are they?" Those words have followed me ever since, because as much as I wanted to respond, the truth was too bitter. No one was coming to save them. The machine was too big, the players too powerful, and society was often indifferent to the suffering of those without a voice. Diddy and others like him continued their lives, protected by money, influence, and purchased silence. But that doesn't mean they are free. Every secret they keep, every life they destroy, is a debt that will never be repaid. And for me, the only way to find some peace is to tell what I know. It's not just about exposing a child trafficking ring. It's about giving a voice to those who have been silenced. It's about remembering that these victims were real people, children with dreams, with lives ahead of them, ripped away from everything they knew and thrown into a nightmare. As I write this, I know that my words could put me in danger. But what is my fear compared to the terror these victims faced? What is my risk compared to the price they paid? This is not just a call for justice, it is an appeal to humanity. Because in the end, no matter how powerful they are or how deeply their secrets are buried, the truth has a way of surfacing. And when that happens, it will be the beginning of the end for them. The legacy of pain that these victims carry cannot be erased. But maybe, just maybe, by telling their stories, we can begin to build a new legacy. One where justice prevails and silence is no longer a weapon.